What might a Kamala Harris presidency look like? I said I'd do it, so I'm doing it. Welcome back to Hypotheticals, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into the official Kamala Harris platform and examining what a Harris presidency may look like. As of August 5th, 2024, Kamala Harris is officially the Democratic nominee for president and will face off against Donald Trump this November. Polls have flipped pretty incredibly in her favor, and some now project her as the favorite to win the election. If you want to learn how she may win, feel free to check out the last video I did if you haven't already. While Harris has been surging in the polls, her platform has remains somewhat of a question mark. She's been reluctant to do many press conferences with reporters, and as of writing this script, her official website doesn't have an actual platform tab on it, unlike other presidential candidates. In other words, we're going to have to piece this thing together. Before doing that though, let's take a few minutes to learn a bit more about Kamala Harris. While she served as Joe Biden's vice president for the past 3.5 years, the rest of her political history isn't as well known. So let's get right into it. Before getting into our deep dive of Harris's platform, we first need to learn a little bit more about how she got her start in politics, as well as where her running mate Tim Walz got his start too. Prior to getting her start in politics, Kamala Harris spent nearly 3 decades as a prosecutor after receiving her law degree from the University of California, Hastings. For those 3 decades, she worked entirely as a deputy district attorney for Oakland, California's Alameda County. It wasn't until 2004 where she would step into the political realm. That year, she was elected as San Francisco's Attorney General, a position she would hold until 2011, when she ran for and was elected as the Attorney General of the state of California. From there, Harris continued to climb. In 2015, she announced she was running for U.S. Senate and was endorsed by both Barack Obama and Joe Biden before winning the seat. From 2016 to 2019, Harris worked as a senator, where she served on the Senate Judiciary Committee as well as the Select Committee on Intelligence. In 2019, she announced that she would be running for president. In a crowded Democratic field, she failed to stand out to voters and ultimately dropped out of the race before Biden chose her to be his vice president. And now we're up to the present day, with Harris taking on Donald Trump this November. She also recently announced her running mate as Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. How did he get his start? Well, prior to politics, Walz spent time as both a teacher and in the National Guard, 24 years to be precise. There's been some controversy surrounding his service, with Republicans saying that Walz stole valor from those who actually served by misrepresenting his time spent in the military. Regardless of how he represented it, there's no doubt that Walz did actually spend 24 years in the National Guard. That's all I'll say about that. Anyways, Walz got his start in politics in 2006, when he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in Minnesota. After that, Walz was re-elected for another 5 terms to serve Minnesota's 1st Congressional District. Eventually, Walz moved on from that position and announced a bid to run for Minnesota governor in 2017. He won the title in 2018 and retained it in 2022. Today, he's officially Harris's pick for vice president. With that very quick summary out of the way, let's now get into what a Kamala Harris presidency may look like, beginning with her economic stances. As I've already mentioned, the current Kamala Harris website features no official platform to base this off of. That may change before this video goes live, but so far I'm working with what I've got. Anyways, let's begin. It's been reported that Harris's economic stances, which are being dubbed Kamalanomics, would not differ too much from Biden's economic policies if she were to be elected. But what exactly does that look like? Well, to point out the obvious, Harris is in favor of increased federal spending, just like nearly every Democrat in the US government. While on the topic of her political beliefs though, this feels like a good time to mention that Harris would be the most progressive president in US history if elected. Now, that's not me saying that she's like a communist or anything, like some people online are saying, but she is pretty progressive overall, and you'll see that demonstrated throughout some of her policies that I talk about in this video. Anyways, back to her economic stances and how those may play into a potential Kamala Harris presidency. In a speech she gave in North Carolina on Friday, August 16th, Harris began to outline some of her main focuses for if she is elected. These include lowering the cost of groceries, housing, and healthcare, as well as advocating for a child tax credit and drawing contrasts to Trump in her views on things like taxes and tariffs. That's obviously a lot, so let's break it all down. First up, groceries. Inflation has been on the minds of millions of Americans for the past few years, and Harris wants to bring prices down. While inflation did just fall below 3% in July, the first time that's happened in 3.5 years, prices still remain above how they were before the COVID pandemic. In terms of how she'd accomplish this, Harris has called for a federal law that bans corporations from setting excessive prices, also known as price gouging, charging, specifically targeting the practices of meat processing companies. Her proposal includes granting the Federal Trade Commission the authority to investigate and penalize abuses within the food and grocery industry. She also wants to address issues related to prescription drugs and housing costs. We don't exactly know how her administration would do this, but we can assume that it may look something like what Biden's campaign has done. For example, through the Inflation Reduction Act, the Biden campaign capped the cost of insulin at $35 for nearly 4 million seniors on Medicare. It's likely that a Harris administration would aim to do the same for more drugs. Now let's talk about housing. There's a reason Harris has become so focused on housing prices, and that's because they've risen pretty significantly under Biden's watch. At the start of Biden's presidency, the average monthly cost for a median-priced home was around $2,100. As of now, according to Harvard University's Joint Center for Housing Studies, it's around $3,100. This is obviously a problem, so under a possible Harris administration, she would push plans to cut costs of rental housing and home ownership, including funding more affordable housing and building climate-resistant communities. If you want a bit more detail, Harris wants to propose providing up to $25,000 in down payment support for first-time homeowners, and even more generous support would come for first-generation homeowners. That's just one of her potential policies that she believes would help fix the housing crisis in the United States. On a more general note, the Harris campaign has said that she will also maintain Joe Biden's promise of not raising taxes at all on people who make less than $400,000 a year. As I mentioned previously, she's attempting to draw heavy contrast with Trump on things like taxes. Trump, for example, cut the corporate tax rate to 21% from 35% and implemented other tax breaks while he was in office. Harris is almost certainly going to increase the corporate tax rate if she is elected president. While on the subject of taxes, we should also touch on Harris wanting to increase taxes on both realized and unrealized gains. Before discussing that though, what's the difference between the two? Allow me to explain using the knowledge I obtained from the one economics class I took in college. It's pretty simple, and you can think of it like this. Let's say you invest in a stock at $1. The price of the stock goes up to $5 and then you sell it. Congrats, you've now made $4. That's considered a realized gain because you sold it. Based on that, you can probably figure out what unrealized gains are. It's simple. Let's say you buy a stock again at $1 and the price goes up to $5, but this time you don't sell it. You've still made $4, but the gain, aka the sale, hasn't been completed or realized yet. As I mentioned, Harris wants to increase taxes on realized gains. That makes sense. Many Democrats would probably be in favor of something like that. The idea that has caught many off guard though is Harris also wanting to implement taxes on unrealized gains. This is basically unheard of in the United States, and it's caused quite a stir on social media. Part of her economic plan includes a 25% tax on unrealized gains, but it would only be applied to those with wealth that exceeds $100 million, meaning it would only impact the wealthiest 0.01% of the country. In other words, that would keep to the promise of not increasing taxes on the middle class. I know this section is probably pretty boring, but don't worry, I'm almost done. If you remember correctly, I mentioned something about a child tax credit a couple of minutes ago. Harris has long been a supporter of this, which would reduce the tax burden on low-income families. Earlier this year, a child tax credit bill passed in the House but then stalled in the Senate. You can fully expect Harris to push harder for this if she's elected to the Oval Office. Overall though, there aren't a ton of key differences she'll have economically when compared to Biden. I think this paragraph from a Reuters article sums up her economic stances quite well. Quote, "Same values, different vision," said one aide describing how Harris's economic agenda will be different from Biden's. She's not moving far away from him on substance, she will highlight the ones that matter most to her. In other words, she'll be working to accomplish the same economic goals that Biden has worked on, just in different ways. While it's not entirely known how Kamalanomics will differ from Bidenomics, you can expect plenty of similarities. With that in mind, let's now get to another key question. Where does Kamala Harris stand on foreign policy? We all know that the world is going a little bit crazy right now, so what might a Kamala Harris-led administration do about that? There are basically three key areas of the world that I'm going to address in this portion of the video: the Middle East, Ukraine, and China. Those are arguably the three areas of the world with the most tension right now, with two of them having active fighting taking place. There are obviously other areas of foreign policy that Harris would give attention to, but since that's harder to predict, I'm going to focus on the areas that would be of the utmost importance for a potential Harris administration. First up, let's talk about the Middle East. Specifically what's going on with Israel and Palestine. If elected president, Kamala Harris would be the most pro-Palestinian president that the United States has ever had. However, that doesn't necessarily mean much either. While she has gone on record to say that she supports both a ceasefire to end the fighting between Israel and Hamas, and has openly said she favors a two-state solution, her beliefs on the situation are somewhat of a proxy to Biden's. What does that mean? Well, it tells us that if Kamala were to be elected president, the US would likely continue to send aid to Israel. However, there may be some caveats to that, as Harris has not not been historically as Zionist as Biden. For example, as a US Senator, Harris opposed an anti-BDS bill that was backed by Zionist groups. Going further, Harris also did not rule out consequences for Israeli forces when interviewed about Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's choice to invade Rafah, which was supposedly designated as a safe zone for Palestinians fleeing the fighting in the Gaza Strip. Overall, I feel like this paragraph from Open Democracy sums up Harris's stance quite well. Quote, Harris has not criticized any of Biden's or Israel's choices in Gaza, but she has been more explicit about the scale of human suffering among Palestinians, saying she will not be silent and that a two-state solution must ensure Palestinians can exercise their right to freedom, dignity, and self-determination. To sum it all up, Harris believes that Israel has a right to defend itself from Hamas and other potential aggressors, but she has also criticized Israel's military strategy in doing so, saying that it's been responsible for the loss of too many innocent lives. It's ultimately unknown whether she would take action against Israel for its military strategy, but she has not ruled it out in the past. Anyways, let's move on to the war between Ukraine and Russia. This should be a quicker section. No surprise here, Kamala Harris is on the side of Ukraine. She has met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky 6 times, and she also led the US delegation to the Ukraine Peace Summit in Switzerland in June of 2024. It's safe to assume that Harris's policy on Ukraine would look similar to Biden's, though Biden's strategy wasn't as comprehensive as you might think. Sure, they've sent aid to Ukraine, and Harris would continue to do so if she can push Congress to pass more aid, but the lack of a clear goal in the Biden administration's policy has made for a confusing scenario. To be clear here, the current goal of the Biden administration seems to be less of help Ukraine defeat Russia and more of help Ukraine defend itself without making Russia angry. And there's a difference between the two. Maybe she'd change this, but I kinda doubt it. There's nothing about it in her official policy, and nothing she said in interviews makes me think she would. Regardless, we know for a fact that she would push heavily for more aid to Ukraine to make it through Congress. It just depends on whether or not she'd have enough support in Congress to make that happen. Finally, let's move over to Southeast Asia to talk about Harris's views on China and Taiwan. Harris has made several comments about the situation in the South China Sea in the past, so we can look at those to get a better picture about any potential policy she may have. For one, when discussing US and Chinese economic relations in September 2023, Harris said, quote, "We as the United States in our policy, it is not about decoupling, it is about de-risking. It is about understanding. It's not about pulling out, pause, but it is about ensuring that we are protecting American interests, and that we are a leader in terms of the rules of the road as opposed to following others' rules." Additionally, in 2022, Harris held brief talks with Chinese leader Xi Jinping and stressed the importance of maintaining, quote, "open lines of communication to responsibly manage the competition between our countries." So from what I can gather, Harris seems intent on seeking out economic competition with China, not conflict. That's not to say she doesn't view China as a problem though. On the topic of Taiwan, Harris has reaffirmed that the US would continue to support Taiwan and oppose any actions that attempt to change the status quo. She has also continuously spoken out against China's aggression in the South China Sea as a whole, not just against Taiwan. Harris has a history of calling out China's human rights abuses as well. In 2019, she co-sponsored the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act that was introduced by Republican Senator Marco Rubio. The bill aimed to promote human rights in Hong Kong and sanction officials involved in, quote, "undermining Hong Kong's fundamental freedoms and autonomy." The bill was then signed into law by former President Donald Trump. Overall, those are the three main areas of foreign policy that a Harris administration would likely focus on if she is elected president. There are plenty of other areas that would probably get attention as well, but it's difficult to know what they would be as of now. You might be wondering why I didn't talk about something like immigration and the border crisis in this section, and that's because I'm about to talk about it in this next one. How about that for a transition, huh? With her foreign policy out of the way, let's now take some time to review her social policies. I've decided to place Harris's ideas on immigration under her social stances because I feel like Democrats tend to take more of a social approach to the topic of immigration, while Republicans tend to take more of a foreign policy approach. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but that's my logic. Anyways, let's talk immigration. The border crisis, like inflation, is something on the minds of most Americans in this election cycle. So where does Harris stand on the border? To understand this, we need some background. Trump and other Republicans have constantly attacked Harris in recent weeks for how she has handled the increased number of immigrants crossing the border illegally, claiming that she has failed as the quote-unquote border czar, a role that was supposedly given to her by Biden in 2021. But how true is that claim? It's tough to say. Yes, Harris was given the job by Biden to address the quote-unquote root causes of the migrant crisis. However, there have also been pushes to pass a border bill through Congress, which have failed because Trump himself told Republicans to vote against the bill. Now, Republicans argue that he told them this because the border bill was packaged with aid for Ukraine. Democrats argue that Trump told them to do this so he could make Biden look bad. Regardless of how you view it, that's where we stand as of now. So where does Harris stand on immigration, and how will she fix the border crisis? When she ran for president back in 2019, Harris ran on pretty liberal immigration stances. According to the Washington Post, quote, she promised to close private immigration detention centers, limit deportations, and fight for a path to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. Since announcing her 2024 campaign though, she's chosen to take a tougher approach. New ads for her campaign tout Harris as having backed the toughest border bill in decades, and also promising to hire thousands of new border patrol agents to crack down on fentanyl and human trafficking. However, the Harris campaign is also campaigning on current strategies continuing, as evidenced by the fact that border crossings have dropped for 5 straight months and that they've apprehended 2 of Mexico's most infamous cartel leaders. This move by the Harris campaign is in response to Trump's claims that she failed at the border, so it makes sense politically to do this. Whether or not she'd follow through with these promises is up for debate, but regardless, let's move on to another super fun, lighthearted topic: abortion. Pretty quick one here. Harris clearly supports abortion. In fact, she's seen as a stronger supporter of reproductive rights than Biden. As a senator, she co-sponsored legislation that would ban states from imposing any restrictions on abortion rights, and voted against a bill that would have banned abortions after 20 weeks of pregnancy. She also condemned the Supreme Court's 2022 decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. There's not much she could do to change that, but regardless, it's good to keep her stances in mind. She will likely focus heavily on protecting abortion access if elected. Keeping up with the quickfire, let's move to healthcare. This is where things get kind of interesting, as it's a prime example of where Harris has flip-flopped a bit in terms of policy. In the past, Harris gave strong support to Medicare for All, a single-payer, government-run healthcare system that was championed by Bernie Sanders. However, Harris's team recently came out to say that she no longer supports that plan. So where does she sit on healthcare? As one health policy expert predicted in an interview with NBC News, quote, Corlett predicted Harris would look to protect the Affordable Care Act and extend the enhanced subsidies designed to lower costs, which are set to expire at the end of 2025. She would also be likely to work with Congress to try to extend Medicaid coverage in the 10 states that haven't expanded it under the Affordable Care Act, and she could carry on Biden's attempts to expand Medicare to cover dental, vision, and hearing benefits for seniors. So while Harris would continue some of Biden's healthcare agenda, she would likely try to remake the healthcare system into something that's her own. Granted, that's only a prediction because it's hard to know for sure right now, but that gives you an idea as to where she sits on healthcare. Those are Harris's likely stances on the biggest social issues facing voters in the 2024 election. There may have been a couple that I missed or skipped over by accident, but in my mind, I feel like abortion, healthcare, and the border are the big 3. So with all of that in mind, it's time to wrap things up. We are officially just over 2 months from Election Day now, and things are really starting to heat up. Polls show the race remains tight between Harris and Trump, so who knows where things go from here. It's tough to say, but you better believe I'll have some sort of official election prediction coming in the future. I realize I wasn't able to cover absolutely everything that Kamala Harris would do if she were elected in this video, but I hope I was able to provide you with some good insight into what her presidency might look like. Also, since Harris doesn't have an entire platform posted yet, some of this was just guesswork. Of course, it was all sourced, but it's still guesswork. Speaking of sources, if you'd like to read more about anything I spoke about in this video, you can find my source list linked in the description. I would highly recommend you check it out if you're interested, as it may shine some more light on what I talked about. Anyways, that's all I've got for this hypothetical. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to like and subscribe. More videos coming soon. Additionally, thanks so much for your continued support. I really appreciate it. Take care.